Terrific. Thanks, Craig, and thank you all for staying well into beer o'clock and to talk about planning nonetheless. Wow. That exciting, huh? The duct tape fell out. Okay, terrific, we're back. Thanks. So, I guess a lot of people end up being in the situation, if you're a scientist or a planner working for a management agency, working for a national park, working for a non-profit, of being asked, what are the priorities for management? What are we going to do? And I think a lot of people end up substituting that question for something that's simpler and easier to answer. They say, well, what is the most threatened species? What is the most economically important species? What did we work on last year? What did we work on 2 years before that? What are we good at working on? What is the governor's favourite species? All good questions to answer, and I think there's a role for answering all those questions, but they're not the question that we were asked to do, which is, what are the priorities for us to work on? But the reason why that question is hard to answer is because it's not very well framed. Now, hopefully, we would start with something like Craig described at the beginning, talking about the context, situation analysis, and working out what our objectives are. And Craig and I have been trying to write a book together on conservation planning, and it really forced me to think, okay, how would I describe framing a conservation planning problem? Because to be able to solve it, you need to really frame it in a way that can give you an answer. And I thought, well, there's really from my mind, there's sort of three common elements to framing a conservation planning problem. The first, Craig already covered, I'm not going to talk about it, you have to have good objectives. You need to know where you're going. The second is a good set of options, and by that I mean, what are the alternative things you're choosing between planning, management planning, conservation planning, protected area planning? It's sort of fundamentally about choice. You have to know what those choices are, and I'm going to spend a few minutes in this talk talking about choices and say something challenging about what I think is a reasonable option. And I think that this is generally something we don't give enough attention to. We sort of dive into planning. We spend ages talking about the threats and the system and everything we know about it, and we don't actually spend much time. You sort of get to the last half an hour of a 5-day workshop and talk about the things you might actually do. So they're the first two bits of framing a conservation problem. And the third thing, I would say, is a prediction of how those options are going to help you achieve your objectives. So what are the consequences of those options for your objectives? And I've drawn that kind of as a narrow arrow, which I think is a bit misleading, because I'm sure it's more of a kind of nebulous pathway through all of our system knowledge. That there's tons of uncertainty there, which Mark's going to talk about later, and how we might navigate that. But essentially, we want to look at our objectives and say, okay, of these options, how will they be affected by the things that we've got to do? And that is a task that requires all of our knowledge. And I'm going to kind of argue a little bit later that is what the kind of basis of all of our science is working towards, that prediction of consequence. But to start with options, and I said this is something I don't think that we give adequate time to. And so here's a quick example from a workshop I just did a week and a half ago. And we were asked, okay, what are you going to do in the marine, how are you going to manage, what are the priorities for management in the marine and aquatic part of the Noosa Biosphere Reserve? You could replace this with any question about managing a protected area or anyone's space. It's a pretty standard question. And so we did just what I suggested. We started with objectives, and we had two objectives in this case. One was to increase fish abundance, and one was to increase biodiversity. And I'll get to some problems with those objectives later on, but assume they are what they are for the moment. And we corralled a group of people, about a dozen experts, and we spent a full day and a half talking about options. What could you possibly do? And I put the list of options up here. You don't need to to read that the actual options are important, except to say that they're a really diverse set of possible things that you could do in this place. And I think that's going to be true for most protected area plans. There will be a lot of different things you can do, but they don't necessarily come to mind straight away. So what are some of the things you can do to get a good list of options? Well, the first thing is you can make a really deliberate effort. I said we don't give this enough time usually. I can't really stress that enough. This is something you have to sit down and say, we need to think about all of the options because they don't just appear. And if we don't give them that deliberate effort, what tends to happen is the second bullet point on here, we anchor on something that we've done in the past, the first option that someone throws up, and we end up having a really narrow set that's not actually all of the possible things or even a good set of possible things that we could be doing. Another really common problem is that we focus on constraints. In that Noosa example, this was the biggest challenge I had with this group of experts, is that they always were writing stuff off because they said, oh, that's not going to be feasible. It won't be possible. The commercial fishermen will never buy it. The councillors will never buy it. That's really limiting. And often those people are not really the best people to be making decisions about what is feasible or what is possible. And there's plenty of times to evaluate an option and its feasibility later on. But I think we rule out a lot of options early on based on these constraints. So try not to focus on those constraints. Identify the bookends. What I mean by this is, what is a fabulous, incredible solution, even if you think it's completely unrealistic, that can give you a kind of a nugget of an option there. In this case, in the Noosa case, we were talking about what would be the best possible situation for those things. Fish abundance and biodiversity. Well, one of them would be to get rid of all commercial and recreational fishing. Now, that's highly unrealistic, but it formed a nugget of some solutions about zoning and about management of those industries. And the same with the negative stuff. You could think, what would be a really dreadful solution? Often that could be the spark for a good option too. Follow good brainstorming advice. I won't say there's lots written about that. Build disruption into the process. This is something that I guess people that work in complex systems are really keen on these days. A good way to do it for us is to have someone who's not really considered an expert, someone who doesn't maybe know the system or is kind of naive to the history of what's going on, to throw in oddballs. And we had one of those in the Noosa case, someone who said, it would be really good to provision raptors because that woman had some ideas about how raptors influence juvenile, the schooling behaviour of juvenile fish. Now it was pretty harebrained, but it's a good example of kind of throwing people off onto a different track so they can think about different things. Combine sets of actions to make an option. Now, I've been quite influenced in my thinking by a process called structured decision making that the US Geological Survey and the US Fish and Wildlife Service use a great deal, and it's a process. One of the kind of hallmarks of that process is the emphasis on option generation, and one of the ways that they do it is to do sort of a menu board where you take some key elements and you essentially combine them to make a series of potential options. And finally, you could have different levels of investments. And these are all sorts of ways that you can come up with a stack of different options to evaluate. And so I really want to emphasise that this is a key piece of planning that we often don't give enough attention to. So what is an option? I'm going to argue, perhaps slightly controversially, that only an action is an option. So often I see the outcomes of plans, protected area plans, conservation plans, are lists of priority species or priority habitats. I don't think that they can be legitimate priorities. They don't tell you anything about what you would actually do. Habitats and species do not use resources, and planning is ultimately about guiding the resources we're going to expend. And if you don't know what you're going to do for those habitats or for those species, then first of all, you've kind of got no idea of what resources are required. And the second thing is, perhaps more importantly, you've got no idea what the consequences would be. So this is, I know not everyone will agree with me on this point, but I think it's really important that we're thinking the outcome of any kind of planning, protected area management planning, is prioritised set of actions. And so coming to kind of, I guess, the third piece, and the third piece of this critical framing, there may not be enough Americans in the audience to pick up this. Yogi Berra is an American baseball player who's famous for his sort of elliptical quotes, but accurate, true. Prediction is a difficult task, but I really believe this is the central task of a planner. This is kind of the pointy end of where all of our knowledge, everything we've worked through, all of the science, all of the studies actually get to influence our decision, is in helping us understand if we took an option, what would be the consequence of doing that option. So I'm going to come back to that Noosa example, and I've just grabbed the first few options that we had, and this is known as a consequence table, and some people use it as a tool to kind of actually help work out what they're going to do. But the thing that I find most valuable about this is really a way of thinking about conservation problems, and it literally has just the options we came up with down one side and the objectives at the top. Now, remember I said there were some problems with those objectives. They were, fish abundance. I'm sure Mark will tell me next that it's awfully vague, horribly underspecified. And so to make sure that everyone was talking the same language, we identified some key indicators, if you like, or attributes of that objective, and then said, okay, now we're talking not just about fish abundance, but about abundance of these particular species, and we gave a way to measure it. And it's the same with these options. I've just summarised that as seagrass, but we actually talked about restoration of this much seagrass in this place, and then we were just kind of completing this table in terms of benefit. Now, some of them we just have really qualitative assessment because we didn't have any data. It's just an expert's assessment of what that benefit for that objective would be. And in some cases we had formal predictive models to help us, and so we have actual quantitative numbers there. And if I had to kind of give a guide as to what planning is all about, it's about completing this table. Even if you didn't call it a consequence table, it's about kind of lining up our options with the outcomes for objectives. And this is also, it can also be really helpful for flagging where you have a lot of uncertainty, where you could go and resolve uncertainty to improve it. And so I really find this helpful, perhaps most as a framing. So now to the final piece, lining up those options with an objective can be a bit of a stretch sometimes, especially if you've got a lot of intermediate objectives, as Craig mentioned at the beginning. You're saying you want fish abundance, but you're actually working on habitat restoration that has a few steps away from getting to those ultimate things. And so one of the things that I've found most useful with going through with teams is to do what's called a theory of change. And you can use kind of any other term, a logic, model, results change. They're not exact synonyms, but the kind of core purpose is the same. And that's really an articulation of how any action you're picking is predicted to affect the objectives you care about. This is also useful because that sort of planning I was talking about at the beginning often is kind of predicated on the fact that you have a bit of a clean slate. In fact, I suspect most of the time planners get into this situation where they're being asked to talk about, okay, what can we do given these are already our existing activities? And this is a really useful way to start there, because you can start with those existing activities and say, okay, what do we know about how they're affecting our ultimate objectives? So I'm going to go to a quick example of what I mean, and don't expect to read this, but this is a theory of change for a program in Papua New Guinea, a forest program. And the kind of hallmarks are that you have the context that Craig was talking about up here, the things you care about here, and then in between here a whole pile of actions and sort of outcomes, and then intermediate actions. Now, there's lots buried in here, and often one of the things is people do a theory of change, they put tons of boxes, so you can't see because this is a PowerPoint, but essentially all of these are like rollovers. So the way we do it is, this is a PDF, but when you roll over it, it brings up the assumptions that are contained in each of these links. And that for me is what kind of really enriches a theory of change compared to, say, a logic model or results chain, is saying, okay, not only is this how we think it's happening, but these are the assumptions we're making to get from A to B. And in this case, we were using this for a particular purpose, which was to talk about what would be the science investment priority for this forest conservation program. And so one of the ways we did that was to say, okay, this is our theory of change. This is our hypothesis about how our actions are leading to our fundamental objectives. And this is what we believe the kind of weight of evidence behind that is. So each of these colours are a reflection of an assessment about evidence. And so our assumption was, okay, some places we have really good evidence of those links, and some places, especially as you get closer to the fundamental objectives, you can see we're less confident about that evidence. And so this is a way that you can use that same theory of change to, guide investment in science. You can also, you can do a lot with this too, building on Morena's idea of mental models. We use this as a framework to predict consequences for a whole pile of actually build these actions, you build up a results chain, and you can often do some simple qualitative modelling, just asking people what they think the strength of the connection along there, and it's a way to help get at what you think the ultimate outcome will be. And how strong that connection is. And they also make really terrific communication pieces. If you couldn't stand up, or anyone in your program couldn't stand up and say, okay, this is how our action is going to get to that endpoint, then it's probably a good guide that you need to go back and think again. So I'm going to stop there, but the kind of key take-homes from mine were that options represent kind of a critical part of planning. All options should be some sort of action, not a species or a habitat, and that predicting consequences is kind of the key task of conservation and management planners. Thanks.